Thank you very much indeed for that very warm welcome, for which my publishers would have been extremely grateful. And thank you for the invitation today. It's some time since I've been to Berlin, but I'm hoping to come here more regularly in the future. The university of which I'm Chancellor, this is called bragging, has just come top in the global rankings for the 4th year running. Has established a good research collaboration with several universities here in Berlin. So I'll be back fairly regularly, and we're having a big European alumni meeting here next spring. And perhaps I can say something else about our relationship with Germany. I apologize for not being able to address you in German. Until 1926, you couldn't study German at Oxford University, because the assumption was that anybody who was intelligent enough to come to Oxford would of course speak German. I look forward to the day when that's the case again, though I may have to wait a little while. And certainly the relationship historically between Oxford and Germany has brought out some of the best on both sides. In 1914, a few weeks before the first terrible European civil war broke out, more than half the people to whom we gave honorary degrees were German, including Richard Strauss. And at the beginning of the First World War, there were two frantic activities going on. One was a couple of professors trying to encourage young students to join up in the British Army. The other was a couple of other professors trying to ensure that the existing German students at Oxford got home before they were put in prison for the duration of the hostilities. I'm the first Chancellor in 80 years not to have fought in a world war. For me and for others, it's rather a profound point about Europe. My predecessor but one was Harold Macmillan, who was wounded 5 times in the First World War. His successor, my predecessor, Roy Jenkins, fought in the Second World War, as did Ted Heath, who pioneered our entry into the European Union. And for them, membership of the European Union was a profoundly moral issue as well as a strategic one. Let me give you one example. When you look at war memorials in Oxford colleges and Cambridge colleges, like the one in the Cambridge College where my wife's father is remembered. He was an Olympic athlete. He ran in the 1936 Olympics here in Berlin, came 4th in the high hurdles, not quite good enough. But then the American competition was pretty fierce. And he was killed in near Falaise in 1944. And if you look at the war memorial in his college, and if you look at the war memorial in most Oxford colleges, people are listed alphabetically, with no reference to the country they came from. You can work it out for yourself: Canada, Britain, France, Germany, Italy, German Rhodes Scholars. And for Macmillan, my predecessor but one, who was the Chancellor when I was myself a student, for Macmillan there was a profound obscenity about bringing young men and later young women together to the great universities of Europe. Oxford, the oldest Anglophone university in the world, for bringing them together to study the great works of European civilization. Thucydides, Herodotus, Plato, Virgil, Ovid. And then to send them home to learn to kill one another. And there was a terrible, I repeat, obscenity, as far as Macmillan was concerned, about that, which I've never forgotten. And even though I don't share that with the same poignancy that he would, having been wounded 5 times, as I said, in the First World War, it's something which I can identify with very strongly. And I think something which my children would identify with as well. Let me say a few words about the psychodrama of Brexit, where it comes from, and what I think we're going to miss out in working with Europe, in dealing with in the years ahead, unless we're lucky. I've just been reading a very good book by probably the best modern British historian, Peter Hennessy. Like me, a Catholic scholarship boy, who went for a time to the same school as me. He's about the same age. And he's just produced a book on Britain from 1960 to 1964 called Wind of Change. And he writes about our, on the whole, quite dignified passage from being an imperial power to being a middle-sized European economy. He writes about the years when, with a degree of pushiness, we operated as America's ADC around the world. During, for example, the Berlin crises and during the Cuban Missile Crisis, which happened in my first year at university. And he writes, above all, about something else, which increasingly dominated political thinking in the United Kingdom. He has a chart in his book of the performance of OECD countries from 1951 to 1973, a league table. And at the top is Japan, with growth rate annually over that period of over 20 years of 9.5%. Next came Germany with 5.7%. Next came France, and Italy with 5.1 and France with 5. And at the bottom of the table is the United Kingdom with 2.7. And for Macmillan in government and for his colleagues, the dominating question was whether, and if so how, we could reverse the long-term relative economic decline of the United Kingdom. There were all sorts of things that were tried. We were surprisingly, given that you were talking at the time of about a conservative government, we were surprisingly more interested in the Bonapartism of France, the centralization, the establishment of institutions to try to manage the economy, than we were in Erhardism, in trying to establish a social market economy. But above all, what we recognized in Britain was that we couldn't manage to compete outside the European Union. We tried to set up some alternative, EFTA, and that suited us in a way because it wasn't a customs union and allowed us to carry on with the preferences that we gave to old Commonwealth countries like Australia and New Zealand. But it didn't really meet the problem of our declining economic growth. And first Macmillan attempted to get us into the European Union, rebuffed by General de Gaulle and the French, with de Gaulle repeating back to Macmillan what Churchill had said to him in 1944 on the eve of the D-Day landings, that Britain, if it had to choose, would always choose America and the open seas rather than Europe, forgetting perhaps that in British history we've always got into difficulty when we've tried to cast loose from the European mainland. Well, Macmillan and his colleagues didn't give up. And 10 years later, pioneered by Ted Heath, at my college, as were Jenkins and Macmillan, Ted Heath managed to secure our entry into the European Union. It was not without some difficulty, and the beginnings of an argument which was perhaps peculiarly British. Not just the sort of nationalism which is rooted in nostalgia about the past and delusion about how that past can play into the future, but a sense that we had a special relationship with sovereignty, which was going to be undermined by our membership of the partnership represented by the EU, or the common market as it was then. And the argument about sovereignty in Britain has always been extraordinarily juvenile. Some people think about sovereignty as though it was there one minute, gone the next, like virginity. Others talk about it as though it's a great artifact, like the cenotaph in Whitehall, with nefarious foreigners creeping in during the night to knock bits off and take them home. Others have quite simply forgotten what sovereignty is really all about. It's trying to secure your national interest, yes, but increasingly, particularly when you're less important as a global power, securing your national interest involves working with others. It involves cooperating with others. I can think of barely a single problem which is important in Britain which doesn't require international cooperation. So from the beginning, that argument about sovereignty fed a degree of toxicity into the British political debate about Europe, and Europe steadily became a subject regarded with growing xenophobia by the British, a point made very strongly by Douglas Hurd in the 1990s. When I became a European commissioner, the Daily Telegraph, which has become the main, it's the sort of Pravda for the right wing of the Conservative Party. The Daily Telegraph had an editorial saying that I had turned my back on the British way of life. What did that mean? Most surveys nowadays tell you that the favorite British meal is chicken tikka masala. The ludicrous pinstriped fellow who's now the leader of the House of Commons in Britain said after England had won the one-day international cricket tournament, there you are, you see, we've won without Europe. Well, it's true that apart from the Dutch, not many people in Europe play cricket. But what he'd actually overlooked was the fact that the England cricket team was captained by an Irishman. You had recently an awful, awful tweet from a Brexit MP who thought it was tremendously funny that sharing a table at dinner with Nigel Farage in the European Parliament, when the next door table had been taken by a German MEP and his wife, they'd started humming the Dam Busters March. It's the sort of repellent nationalism which I think is the beginning of a pretty slippery slope. So, turning my back on the British way of life, a Britain whose literature, culture, political life, cultural life, economic life has been tied up with Europe for centuries. We have a German royal family. I noticed the other day reading about in order to better inform one of my grandsons, reading about the Battle of Waterloo, that it wasn't just the case that the battle was largely won because of the arrival at the 11th hour of Blucher and the Prussian army. It was largely won because the center point of the battle was the defense of a farmhouse called La ESMT. And who defended the farmhouse? The Royal German Legion. At the beginning of the battle, 36% of Wellington's army had German as their first language. It was a victory for NATO, as it were, not just for British arms. So our history has been tied up with Europe, and that's why I think most people have found some of the nationalism of Brexit and of the right wing of the Conservative Party over the years so unhappy. For several years, particularly after Maastricht, whichever if there ever was a British victory was that. For several years, leaders of the Conservative Party, at least after John Major, declined to fight the right-wing nationalists and try to put them right about the notion that Europe was entirely a zero-sum game, that everything that came out of Brussels was going to be undermining Britain's interest. There we were. We had Europe on our own terms. The single market, which we're now so keen to get out of, created above all by Margaret Thatcher and Lord Cockfield. Enlargement, which we pressed for very hard, so hard that the French and others thought we were trying to weaken the European Union. Usually on the right side in promoting free trade, though not always. A reason why we haven't got a free trade agreement with the Indians is because Britain dragged its feet. We weren't in the Euro, we weren't in Schengen, but we'd done incredibly well on our own terms. And over the period of our membership from 1973 to 2016, when the referendum took place, the British economy grew faster than all the other major European economies. Faster than France, faster than Germany, a lot faster than Italy. So what's not to like? Not fighting the Europeans, not fighting the Britons on Europe for a better understanding of what the European cooperative combine was all about. David Cameron thought he could manage the right wing of the Conservative Party by introducing into Britain a referendum on the issue, a fundamental contradiction which we'd already had to deal with in relation to Scotland, in a system which is one of not of plebiscitary democracy, but of parliamentary democracy. And many of our problems since then have been because of that tension between a referendum and parliamentary democracy. The Conservative Party in particular, but the British system in general, had always been rooted in Edmund Burke, not in Rousseau. And many of the problems we face today are because of that. That's been overturned. When it came to the actual referendum, there was no attempt by the government to establish a threshold which needed to be cleared in order for the referendum to be implemented. And the referendum was won by Leave, not surprisingly, perhaps because for the previous several years, David Cameron and other Conservative leaders had banged on about how awful Europe was, and then had to turn around and say, actually, it would be a disaster if we left it. Carl Bildt admits to having had the same problem in Sweden over the euro. He was going off to Brussels to demand this or that change in order to allow Sweden to enter the euro. And when those changes were denied by Brussels, he found himself having to try to argue to the Swedish electorate that actually it would be splendid if Sweden still went ahead and joined. In addition to that, the implausibility of Mr. Cameron. There were also straightforward lies told by the Leave campaign about what gave the great benefits which would be showered on Britain if we left. And having voted to leave, the new Prime Minister, Mrs. May, first of all triggered Article 50 without actually thinking what she wanted Britain's negotiation with the European Union to be all about. Secondly, she laid down red lines which made what she said was her objective literally impossible. She wanted to have frictionless trade with Europe, but to leave the single market and the customs union. She'd made two speeches during the campaign itself, in one of which she pointed out the great difficulties involving the Irish border. But it didn't stop her ruling out remaining in a customs union, which is the one way of actually avoiding a problem on the Irish border. There's no example anywhere in the world, nowhere, where countries next to another country, which are in different customs union, don't have a hard border. What the WTO makes clear, among others. So we began negotiating without knowing what we wanted, and with basic contradictions between the objectives of the government and what was going to be deliverable. Mrs. May eventually went the way of all flesh, and Mr. Johnson, as the darling of the right-wing English nationalists, became Prime Minister, leading the most right-wing government and the most nationalist government in my political lifetime. A government which is prepared to ride roughshod over Parliament, which is reckless in the way it deals with the countries of the United Kingdom, Scotland, Northern Ireland, and even Wales, and which has abandoned any obligations to show a sense of fiscal discipline, and above all has, I think, broken one of the great unwritten rules in British governance. We don't have a written constitution. We've done our best constitution writing for other people. But our system does depend ultimately on what a friend of mine, actually the political historian who I mentioned earlier, calls the good chaps theory. The sense that when push comes to shove, people will actually behave decently, that they won't cheat, that they won't lie beyond the extent to which politicians quite often embroider the truth. But that's gone. And I think the consequences for us in Britain for years ahead, whatever happens with Brexit, are going to be considerable. So here we are with Mr. Johnson saying that he's negotiating in good faith with Europe saying, no, he's not negotiating in good faith with them, with the government stuck in no man's land between their right wing, who want no deal, and the country which I think wants a deal, facing being cut off from our largest market, facing having to cope with the consequences of loutish diplomatic behavior around the world, mystifying our friends around the world with what we're doing. Can you still hear me? And I think exposed in a difficult position at a time when our system of international rules and governance is breaking down. And I just want, before giving you as much time as possible to ask questions and to, in particular, ask about Hong Kong, I just want to raise a number of things which I think I would like to see Britain able to be working on with you. First of all, in many respects, the book that's had most effect on me in the last few years, I'd have said Karl Popper, The Open Society, before that. But a few years ago, I read far too late in my life Stefan Zweig's The World of Yesterday, with that extraordinary, that lyrical description of European civilization at the beginning of the 20th century, and his description of how it was shredded in the following years. Fascism, communism, class war, xenophobic nationalism. And the European Union, which was constructed out of the rubble in 1945, literally the rubble, was based on the notion that you had to bring together a series of minorities living in open, plural societies under the rule of law, with all the freedoms associated with pluralism. And that wasn't just what we tried to do domestically. It underpinned our approach to external relations as well. And I worry at the prospect of us perhaps losing some of that moral purpose in Europe and outside. I look, for example, at what's happening in Hungary. I look at Mr. Orban. I look at what Freedom House says about Hungary, which Freedom House describes as partly free. Partly free. And I wonder how much authority we will have in arguing the case for human rights and democracy in our relations with countries outside the European Union, unless we're prepared to stand up to that issue. Of course, that sort of demolition of moral purpose is made more likely by populism, by populist nativism, by populist nationalism, and that itself is made more likely by extravagant concerns about immigration. I don't believe anybody who tells me that extreme nationalism doesn't have invariably its roots in immigration. I look back to the history of Britain in the 1960s. You'll have heard of a very clever nationalist politician called Enoch Powell, who in 1961 made an extraordinarily beautifully written speech about English nationalism, which was balmy, but beautifully written. English churchyards, English ecclesiastical architecture, the poetry of the 18th century, and so on and so on. And at the end of it, Powell, who was a classicist, talked about that passage in Herodotus when the Athenians returned to Athens after it's been burnt to a cinder by the Persians. And in the middle of the ashes, there's one olive tree sprouting green roots. And Enoch says that someday we'll come back to England and there'll be a proud English oak sprouting green. Nobody took a bit of notice, a blind bit of notice of the speech. But 5 years later, he made another speech about English nationalism. And he talked about immigrants having the whip hand. And he talked about grinning pickaninnies. And he talked about excreta being pushed through old ladies' letterboxes. And you bet people took note then. And again, you see it in the United States with those demonstrations in Charlottetown, for example. The signs about blood and soil. Again and again, nationalism goes hand in hand with extreme attitudes to migration. And I think it's really important that in contesting that, Europe recognizes it has to deal with some really big and profound issues of migration over the next few years. For 4 centuries, Europe has exported people to other continents. For the last 50 years, it's been importing people from other continents. And in the last few years, perhaps the last decade or so, the net increase in Europe's population has been migrants. And that's going to become an increasing problem, both because of insecurity around our borders and because of demography. With Europe with a falling fertility rate and greater longevity, with sub-Saharan Africa with greater longevity and a falling of fertility rate which will have fallen but is still in many Sahel countries, 7 for every woman. So we're going to have to cope with these issues, and to do so by bringing together intelligently foreign security, defense, trade, economic policy, to try to ensure that we're not surrounded by failed states which, since they can't export anything they make, fetch up exporting impoverished people. And that's a really big issue which can only be dealt with on a European level. And I think that Britain has to understand that it should be part of that process and of that effort as well. And we'll be swept away by populism too. The other 2 things I just want to say very, very briefly. First of all, we have to recognize that the 2 greatest powers in the world now don't believe in an international order, don't believe in an international rules-based system. President Trump doesn't, President Xi Jinping doesn't. We must hope that President Trump is a one-term president. In my view, 1 term too many. But as for China, China is going to remain a big and important power in the 21st century, so long as authoritarianism can be sustained. And that I don't believe is forever. But this is a great power that doesn't believe in the rule of law, doesn't believe in civil rights, doesn't believe in the same degree of human dignity that we take for granted. We didn't invent it. You can make a good case for saying the Indians invented it. But if you don't believe in that, then you get Xinjiang, and you get what's happening in Hong Kong at the moment because the Beijing government won't allow the local government to do what it should do in order to cope with the unrest. And the final point I make is a return to what I said earlier, that every issue we face pretty well needs greater international cooperation. Above all, the existential issue of climate change. We haven't got anywhere near implementing what we promised to do in Paris. And whereas in Paris we were hoping we'd avoid a 2% increase in global warming over the next few years, now we're talking about whether we can avoid 3% or 3.5% or 4%. I think that Europe is going to be faced, unless it's prepared to stand up for itself, with being trapped between America and China. But there's a hugely important role for Europe to play, and I hope, my God, I hope that sooner or later Britain will be part of this, a hugely important role to play in making the moral and practical case for greater international cooperation. So, what lies ahead? There's a great Spanish proverb which was turned into a poem by the Spanish poet at the turn of the 19th and 20th centuries, Machado. Caminante, traveller, no hay camino, se hace camino al andar. There isn't a road. Roads are made by walking. And we've got an awful lot of walking to do. And I hope that sooner or later, Britain, after this awful nationalist psychodrama, will be walking with you. Thank you very much.
Want some water? Thank you very much, Chris, for this remarkable speech that not only guided us through twists and turns of European-British relationship, but I think most importantly returned all the memories that we have of British decency, wit, civility, and intellectual capacity that we are so much missing at the moment. So thank you very much for that. And if I may, I start with Hong Kong. I still remember the 1st of July 1997. I was there with thousands of other people in pouring rain. Around me, people in tears when the British flag was lowered, and you and your wife and your 3 daughters boarded the Royal Yacht Britannia. And I remember the speech that you gave before you left, where you praised the people of Hong Kong. And you said they are extraordinary in what they have achieved against the odds. And we might now see a situation where they have to prove again that they are willing to achieve something against the odds. We had Joshua Wong here, one of the young activists. He met the German foreign minister on the occasion of a reception. They took a photo, shook hands. And the Chinese reaction was that they disinvited the newspaper that had invited and organized this reception. And they called in the German ambassador in Beijing to threaten severe consequences. I find this amazingly traditional and unsophisticated, to be honest. And I'm wondering what you make of it. First of all, of course, the question is, can Hong Kong, in your view, remain its status? And what would be your advice to Western governments that are now facing this kind of situation where they have to decide either in order to support democracy and everything that we are standing for versus probably business interests?
First of all, I don't believe that any government, any system which has to behave like that, any system which feels it has to censor on the internet, the comparison that was being made between President Xi Jinping and Winnie the Pooh.
Yeah.
Any system which feels it's obliged to behave like that is not, in my view, frightfully confident about how long it can sustain the way it actually operates. Let me put it in the context of Hong Kong. Hong Kong was an immensely difficult issue morally and politically for both the Chinese and the British. It was difficult for the Chinese because Hong Kong's acquisition by the British, or at least that part which was won forever, allegedly, and the part which was leased for 99 years. Hong Kong represented one of the most humiliating episodes in Chinese 19th century history. But it was also an embarrassment morally, as well as politically, for China, because more than half the population of Hong Kong were refugees from communism in China. They were people who'd swum through the waters around China, who clambered over razor wire to get into Hong Kong, to get away from the Great Leap Forward, or the Great Famine, or the tyranny of communism, of Maoism. And this was quite a difficult thing for the United Front in Hong Kong, or the Communist Party in China to face up to. Difficult morally and politically, because for Britain, because we recognized that the way in which we'd acquired Hong Kong was intolerable, and one of those episodes of the past which you couldn't possibly defend in terms of the 20th or 21st centuries. But also very difficult for us because it's the only colony we've had pretty well where we haven't been able to promise that we would prepare people for independence, that we would encourage the development of democratic institutions when we tried, not hard enough, in the 60s and 70s to develop democracy in Hong Kong. Zhou Enlai and other Chinese leaders said, no, you can't do that. If you do that, they'll think they're going to be like Singapore. They'll think they're going to be an independent country, and that's never going to happen. So it was a very difficult on both sides, and the Deng Xiaoping formula of one country, two systems, that Hong Kong would return to Chinese sovereignty, but with its own high degree of autonomy, way of life, and so on. It was a brilliant way of actually getting around those problems. For 10 years after 1997, it worked pretty well. Not perfectly, but didn't do too badly. Although the Chinese rode back on the promises they'd made about democratic development. But since Xi Jinping, the grip has been tightened, just as it's been tightened by Xi Jinping with dissident activity in China, with Tibet, and above all with Xinjiang, where there are now 1 million or more people in effect in concentration camps. They're called labor re-education camps. Uyghurs, beard shaved, mosques obliterated, the China dream. What triggered the demonstrations in Hong Kong was, first of all, a bill which would allow extradition of people from Hong Kong to China. Secondly, the continuing resentment of how nothing had changed after the extraordinary democracy demonstrations in 2014. The only thing that had changed was even 5 years after those demonstrations, people were being charged and locked up under obscure public order offences for having taken part in them. 5 years after the demonstrations, no attempt to find a bridge, no attempt to find accommodations to try to make people feel they were part of the system. And those two things, I think, help to trigger the demonstrations which we've seen for the last 3, almost 4 months, and which give no sign of dying down. I suggested towards the end of June, as did the very distinguished former Chief Justice in Hong Kong, Andrew Lee, that at that stage they should announce that the extradition bill was dead and buried, and they should introduce or establish a commission of inquiry to look at the reasons for the demonstrations and to look at the way in which those demonstrations had been policed and the way some of the demonstrators had behaved. There's no question at all that in dealing with the demonstrations, things have been done which break all the rules of public order policing in any democratic society. A subject I know quite a lot about because I reorganized the police service in Northern Ireland after the Good Friday Agreement in 1998-99. And you don't fire pepper spray in people's faces at point blank range. You don't beat them on the ground. You don't fire plastic baton rounds as though you're at a rabbit shoot. You don't use tear gas in that incontinent way. So there were real issues about policing which needed to be looked at. I think Mrs. Lam, the chief executive, hasn't been given any room of maneuver by the Chinese government. Mind you, she hasn't tried for much room of maneuver. I think if she had at that stage done those two things, it would have calmed and quietened the situation. But as it's gone on, with no attempt by the government to connect with the people who are demonstrating, so the demonstrations have become more violent. On Wednesday morning, I saw a group of student leaders. And they said, we have great difficulty in persuading people on our campus not to take things into their own hands, because they point out nothing's worked in the past, nobody will talk to us, so we're not going to lose anything by condoning violent activity, particularly when the police are beating us up and sending in triads to beat us up. So it's a situation in which it's extremely difficult to be optimistic, unless perhaps China has the wisdom to see that trying to reach an accommodation with people in Hong Kong is not a sign of weakness. Authoritarian governments always think that if you try to talk to people, if you try to understand their point of view, it'll be a sign of weakness. Actually, if you don't do that, sooner or later things blow up. And that's been what's happening in Hong Kong.
Okay.
These kids, just one final thought.
Sure.
These kids, the ones who've been here the last couple of days, the ones I was seeing the other day, they're being far more brave than I've ever had to be. I said to one of the student leaders, don't your parents get worried about you? And he said, no. And then when he was going away, he turned around to me and said, actually, my mum does. These aren't, somebody once said to me, a businessman in Hong Kong, they're so radical. I said, if you want to meet radical students, I'll introduce you to some in Oxford. Last point, very briefly. It is absolute drivel to suppose you can only do trade with China if you kowtow on political things. Why does Germany have such a good trading relationship with China? Because you make the things they want to buy. And I think that I was very pleased the other day that the Chancellor raised with Li Keqiang, the Prime Minister, the question of what was happening in Hong Kong. When I was in Hong Kong and involved in a lot of public spats with China about, frankly, very little, they turned me into a democratic hero when I was only trying to ensure that there were fair elections, not a great step forward in democracy, which perhaps I should have been doing. But I was able to point out that in the 5 years before I became governor of Hong Kong, when everything was hunky-dory, our trade with China and investment was going down. In the 5 years when I was having all these knockdown fights, being criticized as a sinner condemned for 1,000 generations, trade was going up. Chinese do trade on the same basis as everybody else. They buy what they want at the best price they can get. When they put Norway onto the naughty step because Liu Xiaobo was given the Nobel Peace Prize, they said they weren't going to buy any salmon anymore from Norway. And it's true that Norwegian salmon sales to China nosedived. Surprisingly, and I'm sure coincidentally, Norwegian salmon sales to Vietnam soared. And salmon sales, and there isn't much Norwegian salmon around Vietnam's waters, to China increased.
Chris, we need to accommodate some questions. And I would suggest 2 questions on Hong Kong, and then we go back to Europe. This is entertaining enough, I think, for the rest of the time. Who wants Hong Kong? Nobody satisfied? Okay, wonderful. Europe. You just recently in a Bloomberg interview said Britain is at the risk to become a failed state. Would you really go that far?
Well, you have ministers criticizing judges for giving independent opinions, adjudications. You have the collapse of what I mentioned in my remarks, I think, that sense that even if you're in different political parties, people ultimately know when the elastic has been stretched as far as it should be allowed to go. The good guys, or the good chaps theory of government that Peter Hennessy has pointed to. You have Parliament being sent away in order not to get in the way of Mr. Johnson's attempts to secure a no-deal Brexit if necessary. These all seem to me to be fairly lamentable ways of treating our system of governance. And if this was happening in an African or a Latin American state, I'd be very nervous about it. I think it's going to be a long time before I can, with a straight face, make a speech in another country about coming from the mother of parliaments. Give me a break. Sure. And mother-in-law of parliaments at the moment.
And now we are foreseeing a campaign, people versus parliament.
Well, that would be the ultimate horror. Yeah. Because it's the sort of thing you do get in, quote, illiberal democracies, an oxymoron, a contradiction in terms, sort of thing you do get in countries which have strongman rule rather than proper democracies. It's an appalling idea and would create even greater divisiveness than exists at the moment.
Okay, please.
Hi, John Major, who you served with in government, is probably one of the most vocal Remainers at the moment. And when you served with him, he fought on Maastricht, he fought for the right wing of the Conservative Party, or the bastards, as he called them. But in his autobiography, after he left government, he still referred to himself, identified as a Eurosceptic. And that's a common pattern across political party leaders in the United Kingdom, especially in the modern Labour Party. And I was wondering whether you thought that the apologism and the lack of defence of the benefits of the European Union by moderates who were supposed to defend it, what sort of impact that had on bringing around the Leave vote? And if you don't mind me adding a very cheeky subsidiary, as a member of the House of Lords, you're very lucky in that you don't have to decide who to vote for in the next general election. But if you did, would you be voting Conservative?
Well, Chris, can I just take another question so that we can use the time? Who wants to? Please, gentleman there, grey hair like me. Yeah.
If I may, I just want to make a statement about Hong Kong. Just one short.
We passed this already.
Yeah.
Oh, okay.
Then not.
Please.
I would like to have a short question about no-deal Brexit and the Conservative MPs' view on the consequences. Are they really confident that the consequences will not be that bad, or is it just playing theatre? What do you think about that?
Well, on that point, there's a problem when a political party becomes ideological, and when it confuses political issues with religion. And the Conservative Party, or part of it, is turned into a sort of cult, which which suffers above all from cognitive dissonance, which finds it difficult to relate evidence to what's going to happen. So if you say there are these dire consequences or bad consequences if we leave the European Union without a deal, they call that Project Fear. They say, well, it's the political elite saying that. So we're now in a crazy position in which the this government's, it's happened under Mr. Johnson, this government's analysis of what will happen if we leave without a deal is being denounced by the government as a product of the political elite. But it's what they've been saying themselves. So it's extremely difficult when a political party, as I said, becomes consumed by ideological, and it turns a political campaign, as I've said in the past, into a sort of jihad. John Major, who's the most decent man I've worked with, and was right about all the big issues in politics. I think he described himself as a Eurosceptic rather than a Europhobe, in particular because of his views on the euro. He believed, and I came to believe, that it was impossible, and this I think is an issue which has some resonance in Germany. It's impossible to have a currency union without a fiscal union, and impossible to have a fiscal union without a transfer union. And I think that has been an issue in Greece and elsewhere. And it will be, unless we're lucky, an issue sooner or later in Italy. Almost as distressing as what's been happening in Britain with Brexit, were the signs during the Greek financial crisis of people with posters and placards in Athens with Mrs. Merkel's face on with a little moustache. The degree of difficulty, if you have bits of a fiscal currency transfer union, but not the whole of it, are very considerable. And I hope that it survives. But like John Major, I was not initially, but I became in favor of not a single currency, but a common currency, with the euro driving out weaker currencies, but some stronger currencies still surviving, one of which would have been the Deutschmark. You mustn't forget that agreeing to the euro, and I think there's plenty of evidence of this, was part of the price which Germany paid for Mitterrand agreeing to reunification. And the papers that have been, I think, discovered by German newspapers, including the results of Monsieur Vedrin's trips to Brussels are extremely interesting. So I don't think John Major was attacking the basis of European cooperation, but like me, he had some doubts about aspects of what others thought was essential cooperation. You lastly asked me if I was able to vote, which I'm not, in the election, who I would vote for. I've made it clear that I would not vote for any Conservative who had supported us leaving the European Union without a deal. I've said that absolutely publicly. My wife has gone rather further than that. But then, women are bolder and more courageous than men. I don't think I won't go into my children's views on these issues, but it's not difficult for me to say what I've just said. I haven't left the Conservative Party, but the Conservative Party has left me. It's left Michael Heseltine, it's left Kenneth Clarke, it's left two other former Chancellors of the Exchequer, it's left our last Justice Secretary, and so on and so on. And a lot of Conservatives know what's happening is wrong, but they're trapped between a small partisan base in their constituencies and what they should believe is the national interest.
5 million Tory voters voted in the referendum 2016 for Remain. So what happens to them?
Exactly. It's sometimes suggested that the Leave vote was to a large degree, Labour voters in beleaguered parts of the country. Mm-hmm. Forget about it. It was above all, of course, those voters exist as well, but it was above all Conservative voters in the plushier parts of the country. Yeah. And particularly those who were older and who hadn't got a university qualification. Because just as it's clear that 73%, I think, of people with a university degree in America voted against Trump, in Britain 75% with a university degree voted Remain. The main, as I said, the Pravda of the right wing of the Conservative Party is a newspaper called the Daily Telegraph, which Boris Johnson used to write for and would write learned articles from Brussels about how the Germans were trying to straighten bananas or ban prawn-flavoured crisps or whatever. All lies. If it's true that he misled the Queen, she's in good company. The Daily Telegraph is like the right wing, is like the activists in the Conservative Party. The number of, I won't give you the figures when I was chairman of the Conservative Party, but the number, like the Tea Party, like the Republicans in the States, the number of activists has decreased, yeah. And as the number of activists has decreased and got older, so their views have become more extreme. Yeah. The same is true of the Daily Telegraph. The Daily Telegraph, as a newspaper, isn't much of a business proposition these days. Indeed, it gets $750,000 a year from the Chinese government to publish a supplement from People's Daily or whatever it's called, Global News. So, unfortunately, the right wing of the Conservative Party and the Daily Telegraph are going down together.
Okay, we have to come to an end, unfortunately. Is there anybody with the last question? Please, yes, go ahead. The young guy with the cap on.
Thank you. You spoke about the road that the UK has to walk to get out of this situation, to find a path out of the situation. And I was wondering if you think that part of this road is a reform of the political system in the UK, and if you had any thoughts on that, and perhaps if you have time, also if you have any thoughts on the future of the Conservative Party in the UK? Thank you.
Please don't give a university answer, but a more short.
Okay, a short answer. First of all, I think that what has happened in the last 2 or 3 years in the United Kingdom is likely to produce a groundswell of support for a written constitution, because we can't go on depending on people behaving properly. Secondly, I think there will always be a role in a society for a party which is pragmatic, which doesn't believe there's a comprehensive answer to every problem, which believes that life, and I think this is like religion as well, that life is about finding a way around a succession of predicaments, one after another. What you require is principled and cautious building on the past, without ever thinking that there is some glorious scheme, whether socialist or ideologically market-driven, which can secure the future. And I'd be surprised if there isn't always a role for a party like that. There was a great English political philosopher who writes in such complex English that I can't imagine many people outside England have read him, called Michael Oakeshott, who says all this in a much more elegant way than I've just tried to describe it. But it's been the great tradition of British conservatism that it isn't ideological, that it is pragmatic, that sometimes you have to tack one way, that sometimes you have to tack another. And I don't think that's necessarily going to be destroyed by the politics of social media and by the politics of identity, about which I've written at some length, with some degree of horror. So I think there'll always be a room for a Conservative Party, but just at the moment, it's having some difficulty establishing that in a way which sounds civilized and sensible.
Okay, so I'm told to stop here. So let's thank Lord Patten, probably the best. The best Prime Minister the United Kingdom never had.
People do say that occasionally very generously. The only reason why they say it is because I wasn't, because they wouldn't have said it if I had been.